Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. We still have some folks that are dialing into the webinar, so we're going to give them a few more moments before we get started. Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us for today's webinar, Clerk versus Social Media, What to Do When a Public Record is Deleted by a Resident. We have Kerry Egbert from the city of Sydney, Ohio, joining us today, and we'll also be hearing from Archive Social CEO, Ray Kerry. My name is Erica Brooks. I am also from Archive Social, and I will be your moderator today. Before we get started, I have a few housekeeping items to address. First, all attendees are on mute. So if you have a question, please feel free to submit it using the question drop-down option in your control panel, which is located out of the app in the bottom of your screen. There will be time for question and answer following the presentation, and we did receive some questions ahead of time that we will be speaking to as part of that. Following the webinar, please keep your eyes peeled from an email from me. If you are joining as part of the IIMC Continuing Education Program, you will receive a link to the assessment for you to complete prior to December 3rd. That date's very important because as part of completion of the assessment, you will be awarded 0.5 CMC education or 0.5 MMC advanced education points. And again, those certificates will be followed up as after you complete the assessment before the end of the year. We have a packed agenda for you today. We're going to hear from Kerry first, where she's going to talk about what is important for you to know as a clerk as you're thinking about social media. We'll then hear from Ray Kerry as he talks about legal, policy, and records, and specifically speaks to what's new in the market. And then I will be back on to help moderate that Q&A with both Ray and Kerry to answer your questions. So, about our speaker. Kerry has spent the last 26 years in local government and has seen her fair share of technology changes from the early 10-base-T networks to cloud-based applications. Kerry spent 3 years as a computer operator with the Shelby County Jobs and Family Services Office, 17 years as an administrative assistant with the Village of Minster, and 1 year as the fiscal officer for the Village of Versailles before landing her dream job as the city clerk with the City of Sydney, where she's been for 5 years. Kerry earned an Associate of Applied Business and Microcomputer Applications from Edison State Community College and a Bachelor of Science, Business and E-Business from the University of Phoenix. Kerry is also a certified Microsoft Office user specialist, a lifelong learner, and self-described workflow animation guru. When she is not working to keep her members of council out of trouble, you will likely find Kerry at a campground with her husband, Ryan, or in front of her computer adding relatives to the 20,000 plus in her Ancestry.com account. She also has 2 teenage sons that she is certain still love her tremendously, even if they don't say so very often. Kerry, thank you so much for joining us today.
Well, thank you, Erica. It's always fun to be here. So for those of you who joined us in June, thanks for coming back. That gives me great confidence. I appreciate it.
Awesome, Kerry. I'm going to hand presentation over to you.
Oh. Slow technical difficulties, but there we go. I think, can everybody see my screen?
We've got it. Thank you.
All right, fabulous. So for those of you who joined us in June, some of what I share with you today will sound familiar, but I have included some updates and a few new stories that I think you will find intriguing in the world of social media. So here we go. As I said in June, it's important to remember that social media is more than just Facebook. So whatever archiving solution you ultimately choose, it should archive all the platforms that your agency uses. In Sydney, we still primarily use Facebook, but our Twitter following is growing, as is our LinkedIn following, and YouTube has been somewhat stagnant, but we're looking at ways to make that more integral part of our communication channels. We've also just recently started a Facebook group that, with the help of Archive Social, I was quickly able to add to my repository. And actually, that decision from the city manager's perspective, for us to even allow the use of the closed group, hinged upon whether or not the archiving solution would be able to include the group. So a couple phone calls to Archive Social, and they walked me through the process to add the new group to the repository. Now it's up to our police department to add the members to the group and let the conversations begin. So that's something we're looking forward to here in Sydney. And I'll give you a look at how our social media following continues to grow. Back in June, I reported that when we started our social media venture back in 2014, and I came on a few months after that, our Facebook page had 864 likes. Well, in June of this year, I reported that we had over 8,000 likes. And when I checked earlier this month, we're a lot closer to 9,000 than we are to 8,000. So that's over 500 new likes and followers in 5 months. And I know we're not done growing yet. So in Ohio, it takes a population of just over 5,000 to be considered a city. So if our Facebook page could incorporate, it would be its own little city. And I know as a traditional brick and mortar city, we generate a ton of public records. And our social media platforms, they're no different. So by definition of public record, again, this is somewhat familiar for those of you who joined in June, there really is no definition between the records rooms that we have that look somewhat like the first picture, where there are stacks of paper documents and file folders, and there's really no difference between those records and the records we create and store digitally in the palm of our hands. So just like other forms of electronic communication, like email, communication on social media can be a public record, and agencies have an obligation to comply with all the open record laws. In all 50 states, social media is considered a public record, and agencies have an obligation to comply with the open records laws. Remember, and this is important, it's the content of the communication, not the format, so whether it's email, social media, or the letter that comes in your door, that makes the communication a public record. I've been in public service long enough to remember when the hot topic was, how do we retain emails according to public records law? Well, folks, archiving social media is the equivalent to that question about email back in the 1990s. So why do you need to moderate and monitor social media? Well, let me share a little story with you from our community. In May 2017, a sergeant with our police department was involved in a use of force incident where he deployed beanbag rounds from a shotgun. This was a very involved case, and the county prosecutor was invited to review the case for criminal charges. While there were no criminal charges, the officer was terminated, and then the public records request began. So, as you can imagine, after much discussion and legal review, the arbitrator's report and the prosecutor's reports for this case were both released. It's important to keep in mind that the name of the victim was redacted from the official public record. But in order to show transparency, our police chief did a social media post with a link to the public documents. This was all posted online on social media, and the comments began to fly. In fact, one of the commenters included the name of the victim in some of her posts. Apparently, she had some firsthand knowledge of the case and wanted to share her side of the story. But because the comment was posted on the city's official page, it was our stance that the comment should be hidden because it included the victim's name. Because remember, we redacted it from the official public record, and we didn't want to be the ones, while this was our official page, releasing that information to the public. We felt it was more important to protect the right of the victim and therefore hid the comment. Plus, our purpose and comment policy prohibits personal information about another person or that violates a person's privacy. If you're interested in our policy, simply find us on Facebook at City of Sydney OH and check out the Our Story widget on the right-hand side of the page. There you'll find our complete policy. It's extremely important for your agency to develop these types of policies that apply not only to your employee use and access, but to citizen conduct as well. These policies will help you insulate your agency, ensure that all federal, state, and local regulations are being followed with relation to privacy and freedom of speech issues. The policy we developed and recently reviewed outlines how the city will respond to posts that contains personal attacks, obscene or inflammatory language, unlawful statements or contents, as well as those comments which are clearly off topic to the information posted. Again, let me share another story. We have a fairly contested primary election coming up for the position of county sheriff. Add into the mix a fairly vocal opponent to one of those candidates on social media, and you can imagine the partisan comments that begin to fly back and forth. Well, by monitoring the posts on our pages, we have a statement that says content that incites arguments can be hidden. It's in our policy, and we follow that policy. If the behavior continues, we do reserve the right to block the offender without notice. And yes, we have had to block users for repeated violations of our posted policies. So do yourself a favor and get a policy posted. I know some communities are hesitant about using social media as a communication platform, but I'm telling you, if you are not online sharing your story, then someone in your community is. And whose version of the story do you want told? For all the good, bad, and ugly, social media is where our residents are getting their information. And social media does take time, some days more than others, but in the end, the City of Sydney feels it's time well spent communicating with our citizens. So what do you need to know? We've learned that social media can generate public records, but the fact that our agencies aren't the only ones creating public records on social media, because our residents are, more now than ever, it's concerning. So if you don't have an archiving solution in place, why is that? Because not only can the public create those records, but they can also edit and delete those records. Remember, I mentioned that our little online city has grown since June by over 500 followers. Well, back in June, I shared that our archive had over 4,000 deleted comments, over 300 edited comments, and over 200 hidden comments. Well, fast forward today, and that number has grown to over 5,000 deleted comments, 30 more edits, and another 30 hidden. So that's almost 100 records a month since June that our residents have been deleting on our online social media. And what's really cool about our archiving solution is that I know in the month of January 2018, we had the most deletions. We had 755 posts, whether they were a post, a comment, or a review, deleted in 1 month. And most of that activity happened outside of regular business hours. Thankfully, our city had the archiving solution in place, so I know exactly what comments were deleted, and I can determine if their content makes them a public record. What's also really cool is that in our solution, I can click on that deleted comment, and the archive will show me the thread where the public comment was originally made. The archive also has the ability to tell me the version history. So in other words, when the edit was made. It's important to remember that social media platforms are not bound by public records laws, and those platforms have no legal obligation to retain and provide your records. It's a little different than the email servers we have, where we have control of those records. In addition, some of the social networks, they really don't provide a full record download feature. They intentionally exclude critical records, such as comments and posts received from citizens, in an effort to protect user privacy. If you're trying to manually archive your social media post, it simply doesn't work. Remember, I said we had 755 records deleted in 1 month, and that all happened in the evenings after business hours. I had no idea those records were created and or deleted. So trying to take screenshots, it just doesn't work. In the end, if you are trying to navigate all the public records, privacy, and legal considerations of social media on your own, you owe it to yourself to invest the time and investigate in an automatic solution designed to meet the demands of your public records.
Kerry, thank you so much for sharing all that, especially the two specific details of what was going on with the work that you do, and the idea that if you're not the one out there on social media telling the story, then someone else will be. It may not be you, it may not be someone from your town, but someone could be picking it up. And sometimes folks ask us questions about, should we be doing social media at all, or what are the real risks and what do we need to think about? And that's really a good setup for me to hand things over to Ray. So before you step in, Ray, let me just do a little bit of an introduction. So Ray Kerry has been the CEO, board member, and investor in dozens of high growth technology companies. He's advised some of the world's largest brands on their use of social media, including McDonald's, Kroger, PepsiCo, and British Airways. And really, one of the things that Ray's had a lot of experience doing is looking at customer experience, from slicing roast beef and serving onion rings as a teenager to working with some of those brands I just mentioned. He's been focused on effectively engaging customers and communities in meaningful two-way relationships since a young age. And Ray, with that, I'd love to turn it over to you.
Well, thank you, Erica, and thank you for letting me put my fish picture here on the intro of my salmon I caught last summer. And also a special thank you to IIMC. So this is my first webinar with the organization, but we at Archive Social have had about a 2-year relationship, and I've worked with a lot of different sort of trade organizations and educational organizations, and this is really impressive around the content that IIMC puts together for clerks and the group that we have here. And I want to thank the group for taking their time pre-Thanksgiving here to spend some time on this educational opportunity. I'm going to talk really at the legal level, right? There's legal. What is the law? What is the policy? How do we interpret that law? What is the practice? How do we practice living that policy? And then how do we test that policy? So there's a speed limit that says 65. My practice is not to go, or my policy is not to go more than 5 miles an hour over. I probably should go the speed limit. My practice is, do I observe that? And then what happens when it's tested and there's blue lights behind me? So we're going to sort of walk through that at a high level, but did really want to thank Kerry, because I think that there's nothing like hearing from a domain expert that's living this every single day. So thank you very much. Did want to take just a quick step back in full disclosure. So I'm the CEO at Archive Social. We are in this business, but this is an educational webinar. So we're really just going to talk specifically about the issue. From a background perspective, I always think it's important for people to know who's talking and what their sort of philosophy and background is at my last job, it was a company called Astute Solutions, actually not too far from Kerry. I was in Columbus, Ohio, and I had the opportunity to work with the consumer affairs department and the social media teams at some of the world's largest brands, Estee Lauder, McDonald's, Dine Equity, which owns Chili's and IHOP and airlines and others. And I was at McDonald's just a few months ago, and I said, there's no such thing as a McDonald's customer. In the same way that I might say there's no such thing as one of your citizens or constituents, because that's not all they are. So a McDonald's customer also went to Kroger. A McDonald's customer also voted. A McDonald's customer had a good or bad engagement with a law officer. So we're complicated folks. And it's really these large brands that are spending most of their time with consumers that are setting expectations. 79% of adults in America are on Facebook, if you can believe that. There are definitely folks that want to engage with their public officials by calling them and waiting online or waiting on hold on the phone. They're just not making any more people like that. So all the new people that are being made want to interface in two-way communications in social media, whether it be Facebook or Twitter others that Kerry mentioned. And so really I'm excited to come from that, I would say, sort of corporate view of social media and see how are we using that really as public servants within government, law enforcement, and also education. So if you want to hit the next slide, Erica, I think you're driving. Am I driving? You're driving? Perfect. So at the highest level, that state level, public records started in the 70s. You guys are abundantly aware, but should you want to get at your public records, this is a resource. You can go to bit.ly SM Public Records, and there you can hover over the state and you can get the current public records of every single state. There's also resources there on the right that will talk about sample policies. It will talk about some of the practices within each state. And there's more guidance in some states than others that have been put out by their records bodies. So I'd invite you to go there to the extent that you haven't in a little while, brush yourself up and get broadly up to speed on sort of public records, and then we can drill down into how that affects things specifically on social media. Next slide. I guess I should apologize too. I am in California, so this is a three-way webinar today. Erica's in our home base in Durham, North Carolina, and Kerry's in Ohio. And I got called out to California. I'm meeting with some of our customers as well as with Google and Twitter out here, some of our network providers. Today we won't get into it, but if you do have questions, we're also spending some time looking at and talking about the California Privacy Act, which is a consumer privacy act that interfaces with social media. And I think we'll be moving across the country from California to New York to Texas and soon to others. It's embodied after some legislation that got put in Europe, in the EU, called GDPR. So not on our agenda today, but I thought I'd let you know why Eric is moving the slides. So speaking of California, our first slide here is not law in California like you could get on that bit.ly URL on the last slide, but practice. So the California Records and Information Management published a guidebook in 2015, and basically explaining that the policy is that social media, just like you heard from Kerry, is no different from other electronic or internet communications. By that they mean email, and you need to have a system for storing that, just like any other system. Doesn't have to be a third-party system, but you do need a system. Let's look beyond California to the next slide, to Massachusetts. So same thing, Massachusetts says, going beyond just that you need to have a system, it points out in their policy from the Secretary of State that, in fact, if you look at the social media networks, that they are inconsistent with statewide retention schedules. And you may ask, why is that? Well, social media was not built, Facebook, Instagram, Snapchat, Twitter, and others were not built for public entities. They were built for private citizens to coordinate with and communicate and share and engage with other private citizens. The issue is it just became the way that people communicate, and those people are also constituents and citizens. And if public servants or elected officials want to engage with people, we have to go where they live. And this is where they increasingly live, in that virtual city of 5,000 or more than 5,000 that Kerry talked about, that is in Ohio, but it's not in Ohio, right? It's on Facebook. And so since it was built for a different purpose, it leaves some real holes. And it will say right on their website that they are not obligated to retain anything. And when things are deleted, they are in fact deleted. And that means all the way through to the backup system. And this has been tested again and again. So Massachusetts points out in their policy that you are obligated to fill that gap, if you will, and provide a safety net where social media companies do not. Next slide. Let's bring us to Texas. So two things here in Texas. So Texas from 2016, and you'll notice a lot of this, the public records laws were put in place in the 70s. And then with the advent of social media, a lot of these statewide practices and policies came out 2014, 15, 16. So in Texas, sort of same thing under this act, said that Facebook page that's moderated by the director of communications, or the public information officer, that's a public record. Very recently, there's a new Senate bill. It just passed in September. It's SB 944 for those of you that are joining us from Texas or others that want to look it up. And it goes beyond just saying that that this is a record and has to be retained and archived as such, but it really talks about who has to do this. So this was a first really that we have seen. And so it set up this concept of a temporary custodian. So essentially whoever posts it is responsible to make sure that it gets archived, that it gets recorded. Even if you do it on your personal device, if there's a request, you have to turn that over in 10 days, right? The good news here is most social networks act in the cloud, or all social networks act in the cloud. So as long as you're archiving in the cloud, you can alleviate folks that post your law officers, city managers, council members from having to deal with their personal devices, because they may use their personal devices on their public pages. And at least we're getting, you can get these things, from the networks, from the APIs, so that you can alleviate them of the concerns, obviously, that they have. It also sets up that almost every agency has a public information officer, even if they don't. So specifically within schools, as an example, if there's no PIO, it's very clear under this new statute that the superintendent is the PIO. So lots of people responsible for coordinating of records, making things, just one step more complicated in making sure that we can get all of this information collected together and archived and comply with that Texas Bill 940. Next slide. So what happens when it's tested? So we have law, we have practice, we have policy, but what happens when things go wrong? So this brings us to Pennsylvania. So Pennsylvania, you say there's a borough, and things are contentious politically, I think all across the country, particularly these days. And there was a records request for some material that was deleted off the mayor's Facebook page. The borough said, we don't have to fulfill this request. That's outside of our archive. It went all the way up to the Pennsylvania Office of Open Records. The borough said, in fact, we are responsible to do that. And I think if you do another click, you'll see, well, what do we do at that point once the Bureau says that we have to release this deleted post? Well, they go to Facebook, and Facebook tells you right there, well, we don't have it. They pursue Facebook for a long time, and eventually they say, we're just up the creek. We can't produce it. And they settle for $9,000. $9,000 is a lot of money. I'm less concerned about the $9,000, although I am about the potential fast follower watchdog groups that say, if we can settle once for $9,000, how many times can we settle for $9,000? So this is a case where with unprotected, when the law is tested, in fact, delivering that deleted post had an economic hit to the borough, to this organization. If we click the next slide, we'll see, just after that, what happens in New Jersey. So this is Glen Rock, New Jersey. So here, this is not necessarily a city page, right? Resident says, I want to have a First Amendment. I have a First Amendment concern. You deleted something, but it was off of a council member's page, right? So the borough clerk says, look, that page is outside of our sort of jurisdiction, if you will. We denied that request. Same thing, that goes all the way up here, not inside the public sort of records group, but up to the Supreme Court in New Jersey. New Jersey says, look, you guys are responsible for fulfilling the requests. We already know at this point that fulfilling requests through Facebook for deleted posts is impossible. This time, $30,000 in New Jersey. And so when this law gets tested, money gets paid and these things get settled. Let's click again and look at what's happening in Florida, the Sunshine State, as we know, not just for their sunshine, but also for the sunshine laws that are here. This is one where specifically the citizen filed the suit directly against the county clerk. So for folks on the phone here, a little closer to home. So the first one was outside the clerk's office. The second one, the clerk was involved. The last one, the clerk's in the middle of this, right? You guys know the joke about the chicken and the chicken and the pig is that the chicken is involved in breakfast. The pig is committed to breakfast. So this is a pig moment where the clerk is right in the middle of it. So twice, and said that the clerk should not have removed my comments off of Facebook. And there's a settlement for $10,000. So these are starting to ramp up in significance. There's one going on in Colorado right now that's at $70,000 and growing. And so we really want to make sure that we get ahead of this, we handle this right. And because when social media gets tested, money comes out. So you can hit the next slide. We've talked about Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Florida. That's what's going on in Colorado. Let's hit Michigan. So this is a very recent, you guys can see here, September 30th in Ann Arbor. So to date, these recent rulings and settlements that we covered were really about a page, an official communication of the city, right? This is one where is a third-party resident filing for a public's information request for somebody that, for a conversation they weren't even involved in. So this is between a public official and another resident. This again went all the way up to the Supreme Court in Michigan. And what was the judgment here was, in fact, yes, that social media record needs to be produced. So this one's ongoing right now. So if you make another click here, you'll see the bullet point. So we don't know sort of the punchline here yet, but when it's tested, in fact, just what Kerry said, it's not the type of communication, it's the content of the communication. And a conversation between a public official and a third-party resident that is related to something that I request is in fact a public record. And just because you don't have it, just because Facebook or Twitter wouldn't store it for you, just because you had a policy that said we don't have to do it, if those policies are in conflict with public records law, people are losing these cases. So next slide. So I feel like the Grim Reaper. I've said this is these are a bunch of things that are sort of scary and outside your control. And I have a little bit more bad news, but then some good news. So the first is that these records, Kerry pointed this out, unlike email, unlike a phone recording, unlike one-to-one sort of communication, it's fundamentally outside of your control. These servers sit at third parties. These third parties built this software for a different purpose, and they have no obligation of their terms of service of providing back data to you fundamentally. The second thing is these are not that old, right? We're in the, most social networks are not more than 10 years old. And in the grand scheme of records, that is relatively new. They constantly change their terms of service, their click-through terms of service. They change through what available data and how you can get that data. And then there are new social networks. We have people now talking to us about Nextdoor and TikTok and others. And so as new social networks, emerge, this is really a pretty kind of wild west out there. Now, I will tell you, on this slide, it says there's no guarantees that they'll preserve or produce records. I would say it's actually the opposite. They guarantee that they won't, that when it's deleted, it's in fact deleted, that they're not in the business of providing archival services. And it really goes against what they're trying to do from a private citizen one-to-one perspective. So they're building this for private citizens. We're using it as public entities. And so there's a gap there. It's a gap we can fill, but it fundamentally leaves a gap, and they guarantee, in fact, that gap's going to continue to exist. Oh, here's the big takeaway. I missed the big takeaway. We went too fast. That I think we've probably belabored the point here that you can't rely on these social networks for your legal record keeping. So the question is, what can you do? And I guess that's the next slide. No, it's not the next slide. Here we have here. Maybe you can click all the way through here. So Kerry talked to you about the month of January when she had 792 deleted records in a month, and averaged about 100 a month. She's seeing just what we have. We have almost 2,500 customers that we do business with. We chose 500 of those that we had across 2018 because we've been growing. So we had 500 for all of 2018, and we looked at their posts. They had on average, in aggregate, 10 million total social media posts in 2018. We then went in May, so wait 6 months later, and found out how many of those were deleted. So, a little more than 750,000, 758,000 deleted emails. So if you divide that out by 500, that means on average, each one of these customers had over 1,500 deletions within, that came from 2018. That's 126 per month. Some of that might not be important content in public records, but a lot of it is. And I don't want to find out on the other side of a Freedom of Information request or a public records request that 1 out of the 15 is the one that I need. So lines up pretty well with the individual data that Kerry brought. I would also note that there's no average month. And so this isn't 126 per month. That's an average, just like Kerry saw. Her average was 100. But in months where things go crazy, when you have an event and things are really, really busy in your social media, that's exactly when you're likely to get a records request, and it's likely when you're going to have a lot of deletions. So, this is there's no such thing really as an average month. When there's a problem, it's likely an order of magnitude, bigger than this, or at least in Kerry's case, 7 times bigger when things go down. Next slide, please. So what happens when you say, well, what does it mean when we delete it, right? How does that work? Well, there's 3 different ways that we would, your data, your important records can be deleted. Again, different than an email, different than other types of records where it's outside of your control. A citizen can just delete their comment. And that might be a comment that's on a public page that needs to be retained. Well, the second thing is, they may make comment, and then you, in fact, have a lot of comments underneath it. So if you look on the left here, you'll see these additional comments. When the header comment is deleted, everything that you said as an organization, everything that you said as an agency is deleted. So a citizen has deleted your official communication, and it's not up to you. And the one that's more widespread, that can have more widespread impacts, is that if a citizen quits or changes their social media name, or otherwise deletes their presence on social media, everything they did is gone. So everything they did, everyone who commented on it, everything that you commented on theirs. And so that's why we can get really a significant change to the public record, a significant change to history outside of our collective control. Next slide. So what can you do about it? We've categorized this. There's kind of 3 different takes. You can say, look, we're just going to go back to the social networks. I hope by now we've talked about the risk that you're taking there. You can go back, you can search on each network, and if what you need is in the 14 out of the 15, it may be there. And you can assemble it from each of the different types of networks. You can spend some time. It's not easy, but I'd argue you're taking a high degree of risks. We've had some customers, more probably in the 14 and 15 timeframe, say, well, we'll just take some screenshots. And if we have screenshots, we will have a sort of a filing system. But if you start looking at the volume we're talked about here, what happens after hours, what happens with deleted, you would have to be taking screenshots. Kerry would have to be taking screenshots and pick up all 700 of those deleted after hours deletions in January. And so in theory, you could talk about, maybe I could capture it, and maybe, if I had, lots of people doing lots of work, and maybe I could organize it in a way that I could remember in my mind and go back and file it. That's essentially what the robot does. That's what archiving software does, because you don't have dozens of people, because you don't have a filing system where you can keep all of these 20,000 posts a year in your head in screenshots to try to recreate them. That's why screenshotting doesn't work. So you can use archiving software. There are multiple folks out there, ourselves amongst them, that essentially organizes that. We go into the back of the social media, we get all of the information, all of the metadata together, and we recreate history in an accurate and records compliant way. So next slide. So what do I mean by we create sort of history? So it's one thing to put in a keyword, and you put a particular keyword in, you get kind of hodgepodge set of results. And then the next question is, well, what's the context? What was that in recreation? What was that in relation to? What was the post before it? What was the post after it? And so that you don't fall victim to multiple public records requests, which is what about this? What about this? What about this? In particular, in expensive legal e-discovery, once these things are either in a lawsuit or threaten to go to lawsuit, you want to replay and reconstruct that conversation, and that makes it much easier to have a robust response to a public information request, because you're really responding with what actually happened, not sort of a loose response that's likely to beg for more requests behind it. Next slide. So cost versus risk. I think we probably hit this one a little bit, but on social media, there's no direct cost right now. There is a trial program where some big institutions, Nextdoor is charging some big institutions, but most of those are private, large institutions. But essentially, there's no sort of ongoing cost. But the cost of your time. It's one thing about this slide we probably add is that you guys have a significant job beyond archiving social media, right? I understand that that's a very, very small part of folks' job, and so there's no independent cost, but the risk is very high. We're seeing this, as we said, whether it's 7,000, 9,000, 10,000, 30,000, 70,000 in Colorado, significant costs, and I said those may be recurring costs of doing business if this hole is left unplugged. Taking screenshots. It's certainly better than not having it, right? The chance that you grab that screenshot and that you can access that screenshot in a time, if everything's sort of time bound and it's a very, very small volume, it may work. Given the volumes that we're talking about it's likely that you're taking some significant risk. But certainly, if you're not doing anything, having an organized way of taking some screenshots is at a minimum something that you should begin doing. Or you could evaluate some software to do this and say this is at the scale where we just need some help from the robot, from some software to organize this in a fashion for us. And there, I think your risk of non-compliance is very low. We build this software intentionally to comply with the practice and policies in all 50 states. The ongoing effort is very low. Hopefully Kerry vouched for that. If you have a records request, at least our organization, we stand behind our software. So you can do it on your own. It's very easy, but you also can call us. And the annual cost is typically low. 90% of our customers are less than $5,000 a year. It's obviously different at some of the large cities or larger organizations, but generally it's relatively low, although I know low is different for every organization and sort of budget cycle. Next slide. So I give a lot of sort of doomsday sort of scenarios in difficult scenarios. So I thought I'd start with one close to home that says, what happens when it's sort of done right? So we're headquartered in Durham, North Carolina. It's where I live when I'm not on the road, or I live just down the street in Raleigh, North Carolina. And being in the South, there's being anywhere in politics and public life, there's lots of controversy, but specifically we had some recently around Confederate monument being taken down, and there were pros and cons like there are on in any particular issue. And if you flip the page, let's see what happened when that happened. Well, the first thing is that we had a customer for a long time. The city had a policy for archiving, but the city council didn't. You can just click all the way through the bills. And after these controversies, kind of in 2017, the city staff said, look, we ought to get the council on board here. We should start archiving. And then the Confederate monument situation occurred. Records request happens. The city clerk goes in. Her name is Amy. If you guys want to talk to her, she has an incredible policy that she has built here. It's been a model that we know we've had lots of different cities use. She was just in our office the other week, and she went in in 10 to 15 minutes. She went into the archive and the council's archive and responded to the request, and everybody moved on. There was no article in the newspaper. There was no settlement. You don't hear a lot about this, and that's what we want, right? We want everything operating quietly in the background. I'm sure there are a lot of incredibly exciting things about being a clerk. We don't want to be one of them in records requests. So a success story when you have a good tool, when you have a good policy, when you're following the policy, things can be easy. So next slide. Oh, so just click through here. So number one, I think I hope everybody's on board with this, that you're on this call for a reason, that social media is a must for your agency. If you have elected officials, if you want to serve your community, you got to go out and be where your customers are. And it is the modern way that people want to engage. So I think the horse is out of the barn on this one. A good policy might be don't use social media from a records retention perspective, but it's not a great citizen engagement policy. And it's not a great sort of serve your community policy. So, I think social media is here to stay, and it's only going to get more complicated, like most sort of technologies out there. Across the country, people are receiving records requests. And this is on the rise. I worry that it may be on the rise not only for good reasons and transparency and freedom of information reasons, but also for potential litigation and settlement search reasons. And so that's on the rise. And we'd urge you to sort of take action now. With some networks, we can go back and collect some data, but there's some that's lost forever. And we can't go back and get. And so urge you to get a plan in place before somebody shows up looking for that record that you can't produce. Next slide. So we're going to launch a poll, but I do want to invite folks for a follow-up. I've long believed at the companies I've been involved in that we have to be co-travelers in this sort of journey together. And so we'd invite you to call us if you have questions about the law, questions about that bit.ly map that we put out, questions about your neighbors and what your neighbors are doing with 2,500 customers across the country. We likely have somebody close to you that you can talk to, and we'd be willing to make an introduction to. And then if you have questions about a record request, certainly if you're somebody that we work with today, you're probably already calling us. But if you have a records request and you just don't know what to do, we may or may not be able to help you. We could certainly give you some advice around sort of what to do. So none of it will be sort of a sales call. We want to engage in the issue. And I've long thought if we're co-travelers trying to help out on this issue, everyone together, our business will take care of itself. So hope this was a useful resource to you. I'd like you to please fill out the poll. Please do the follow-up and get your credits. Follow up with Erica, Kerry, or myself with questions. And Erica, if I'm doing this right, it's my first one. I'll pass it back over to you for some questions.
Yeah, that's perfect. We've got about 12 minutes for questions. We have lots that have come in live during the presentation, and we have several that we received in advance. So before we jump in, Ray, I wanted to thank you for your thoughtful and considerate, and also the pig and chicken joke was pretty awesome. I didn't know we were going to go with that. I was like, oh yeah, that's a good one. So thank you very much again. To get started, Kerry, I actually want to throw the first question over to you because I read it and I just immediately thought of some of the conversations we've had about your experiences. And it is this: is there a way to control council members' commitments on their Facebook page or any other Facebook page? I'm sorry, council members' comments. And how do we keep those records?
I really wish there was a way to keep them from making comments on social media, and in some cases even making comments in public. But the best thing I think as a clerk we can do is to educate them about public records, especially when it comes to their social media. Sometimes I don't think they realize when they're having a conversation on their first personal Facebook page with their neighbor 3 doors down about the fact that their garbage didn't get picked up. I don't think a lot of them realize, hey, this is a conversation about what the city does, and it could be a public record. So I think Ray touched on this with the Ann Arbor case. They're not only putting themselves at risk, but they're putting the city at risk too. So their best course of action for us anyways is to educate them, but then to have the have the individual who has the concern say, "Thank you for your concern, but could you please contact the city? Someone there would be happy to help you."
Fantastic.
And
And
I would just add, like many things, transparency can enforce behavior. So if you're letting people know that not only do you have this responsibility, but per our state, per our policy, this is being recorded. And
I think that's very true.
yeah, it just reminds people to sort of check themselves and say, you're operating in an official capacity. You are an official. This is being recorded. If Kerry, if you have a full way of getting council members to do what you ask them to do, let me know. I'm going to use it with my teenagers.
That would be magic.
Yeah, but I do think that just to sort of chime in there, that letting people know that things are on the record helps people remember their responsibility.
Fantastic. And speaking of things being on the record, Kerry, I'm going to also send this one to you. If you record as an audio record council meetings and post on YouTube, is this considered a public record? We keep the WAV file, so wouldn't this cover public record responsibilities?
You're right, and that's just a copy of what you're posting. So if you can produce the record, the WAV file, the problem comes in is, what if people begin commenting on your YouTube channel about something that was said during the council meeting? Then those comments on YouTube could be a public record, especially if people engage in a conversation back and forth on the issue.
Okay. So it really comes down to the comments and what you have there.
Correct.
Awesome, great. And then Ray, I have one for you. Does Archive Social respond promptly to public records request? Are records disposition forms completed for deleted social media content?
So I'll take the first one. So this is more about us, I guess, than the industries, but I'll take it anyway. The answer is yes. We have a team of CX specialists that are there to help people in public records requests. You can go into the software and just handle it yourself very quickly if you have our software, but you can call our team, and that team is available to ensure that if it's a complicated request or if you just want sort of hand-holding, and they're available to the customer base at all time. The second one, I want to make sure I'm interpreting it correctly. So if whoever asked wants to follow up if I misinterpret it, it says, are record disposition forms completed for deleted social media content? First is, we at Archive Social don't delete any social media content. You may have a records retention policy, go into the archive and enforce that. Or we have one network, Twitter in particular, that will, via the API, make us delete some things. One, we notify if Twitter asks us to do that. Each network's a little bit different. That's the only one that operates that way today, and we can get into more detail if people want to on that. The second is, if anything is deleted, if you go in and you enforce your document retention, we log everything. So the data will be gone, but the fact that the disposition happened and those logs are there. But I think the specific sort of forms to be filled out would be the responsibility of the clerk. We would have all the information to ensure that that if something is deleted because you want it deleted, we've logged that that has happened and can produce that record for you. So if I got that one right, awesome. If you had a slightly different question around the disposition forms, feel free to just follow up.
Great, thanks, Ray. And anyone that wants to follow up, you all have my email address from the invites and from the reminders. So feel free to shoot me an email if you have questions following this, just second follow-up ones. I'm more than happy to write those correctly. Before I kick the next question over, which is going to go right to you, Kerry, I'm going to be closing the poll while she addresses this one. So if you want to respond, go ahead and get that answer in. And Kerry, this question: if a council member has a personal Facebook page and mentions town-related business on there, is it a public record that is FOIA-able?
I believe, in my opinion, it is absolutely. It could be a public record, yes, because they are talking about the actions that the city or the community does in And I know we have some individuals who just say, well, I'm just passing along the information. Well, but if somebody engages in a conversation on your personal Facebook page and not the city's Facebook page, you as the elected official, are you going to be able to produce those records? Again, I think that goes back to the third party conversation that Ray mentioned in Ann Arbor, where they are going after an individual or an elected official for something that happened on their private page.
Fantastic. Thanks, Kerry. And then I have one for both of you. And we're going to start, Ray, with your response to this one. Then, Kerry, we'll move over to you because I think you have a unique perspective on this as well. We've had several of our peers decide not to rely on social media due to the perceived risk of lawsuits. In addition to our responsibility to archive and maintain records of posts and comments, what other risk do we need to consider?
So the first is, I think that I would argue that it's a risky situation, and it's logical to say we don't want to be involved in that. The issue is, depending on the community, I'm not sure it's practical. If you want to engage with your citizens, it's likely you're going to have to take some degree of risk. You could stop answering the phone and turn off your email. And I would argue right now this would have a larger impact on your ability to engage with your constituents than the former. So it is. There's definitely risk involved, but I think it can be mitigated. Beyond archiving, the biggest risk really is, I would say, in training your responses. There's a human element here when you have folks that respond, and no amount of archiving is going to solve the problem of people inappropriately responding to either trolls on social media or people just interfacing with the public in the wrong way. And this is just more widespread and more public than it ever has been before. So there's risk that makes sure that people understand, and this is part of that policy that I talked about. When do you engage? What do you say? What's acceptable? When do you say I'm sorry, and when do I'm saying I'm sorry you put yourself in a liability situation? So yeah, I think there's a lot more in that practice and policy than archiving alone. But Kerry, I don't know if you have comments on the risk to consider and to try to overcome.
Well, I think from our perspective, the biggest risk is if we're not telling our story, if we're not out there saying this is why Sydney is good, this is what we have to offer, we have people out there telling the opposite story and saying, oh, you don't want to move to Sydney, or you don't want to do this, or we have a local group, and they actually have a bigger following than the city's page does, but it's the you're from Sydney if group. And thankfully, some of the individuals involved with that, they share a lot of the information that the city posts. And so we are getting our story out there correctly. And so, but if we didn't, and this group was the only one reporting our news, they could spin it based on their political views or their personal views with the city. So I think our biggest is, if we're not telling our story, who is?
Yeah, this idea, I've done a lot of work in communications in my background, and there's this philosophy that nature pours a vacuum. And so if you're not communicating and telling your story, someone else will, because that vacuum needs to be filled. So it's definitely an interesting thing to think about as a risk, because lots of people just think of the legal component, but there's also the communications risk too. Good. So we have time for one last question, and Kerry, I'm gonna send it to you. We had a post from our police department go almost viral overnight with over 100,000 views, and the comments were mean. The chief deleted the message because people were not even reacting to the actual post and were misconstruing the situation. If we save the post offline, is it acceptable to remove the post from the Facebook page?
This one I'm going to approach from a couple different angles, because the first is, do you have a public conduct policy that you could have gone in and instead of deleting the whole post together, because sometimes I think that looks like a lack of transparency and you're trying to hide something, or you're trying to censor somebody from their views, whether they were mean or they were inaccurate. If you had the public conduct policy, you could go in and hide the individual comments that were off topic. I do that quite frequently. I posted something the other day about, what was it? oh, it was about a winter weather system moving in through the area, and I had comments about they didn't pick up my garbage. When can I get a pool pass? So yeah, I do go in and I hide those. I don't delete those. And so I would caution you from removing something just because it went viral and the comments were mean, because we wouldn't censor somebody for their verbal comments in a meeting, and I think it shows maybe a little bit of a transparency issue.
Fantastic. Well, everyone, we are at the top of the hour. I want to take a minute to thank Ray, Kerry, IIMC, and everyone that joined us today for a fantastic webinar. As I mentioned at the top of the hour, please do keep an eye on your inbox. I will be sending out a follow-up email with some of the resources we discussed today and the assessment for you to take for your credit if you are a member of the IIMC. Also, my email address should be in all of the communications you receive from me about this webinar. So if your question was not answered and you would like to speak with somebody, please don't hesitate to reach out to me directly. Otherwise, thank you again and have a great rest of your week.
Thanks, everybody. Signing off.
Thanks again, Erica.